Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and this video is more of my thoughts on nationality, nationalism, patriotism, national identity, and so forth. Now, patriotism was dubbed the last refuge of the scoundrel by the redoubtable Dr. Samuel Johnson back in the 18th century. And I can see there's some merit in that. Now, I'm not against nationalism per se, up to a reasonable level. I'm a bit nationalist myself, but it shouldn't be about hostility to other nations. Sadly, it sometimes turns out that way. It was a bit rich coming from Dr. Johnson, since he was notoriously Caledonophobic. Is that a neologism? But then again, his amanuensis was James Boswell, who was himself a Scotsman. Now, that quotation about last refuge of the scoundrel is often misattributed to Oscar Wilde. But you can see how some politicians, when they're so really scraping the bottom of the barrel, when they've really got nothing else to sell to the public, will wrap the flag round them and just vituperate against another nationality. Oh, they're bad, they're foreigners. It's the lowest of the low. But it's something that even the dimmest person can understand, and some gullible people fall for that. E.M. Forster. You may have heard of that well-known gay novelist of the 20th century, British novelist, and he said, I think it was in the First World War, he said that if I had to choose between betraying my friends and betraying my country, I hope I'd have the guts to betray my country. So perhaps personal loyalty matters more. I know Lord Clark of Civilization took the same view. In personal relations, morality is an individual thing, it's not a national thing. You know, so he was British and he had friends who were German. He shouldn't dislike them in the First World War, the Second World War. Didn't make them bad. They're not all bad, nor were all British people good in the Second World War. People were in an army, this one or that one, simply because of the nationality they're born into, not because they believed or disbelieved in a particular cause or even understood the cause in many cases or attempted to. And they couldn't get objective information because there's so much wartime propaganda, even from the BBC. It wasn't all outright falsehoods mostly, but it was selective, it was deliberately distorted, exaggerated. Obviously from the, whatever, German Rundfunk, it was mostly complete bunkum, completely bogus stories. So people can be friends across war and show humanity to those on the other side, across the trenches. And if nationality mattered so much, there wouldn't be civil wars. And almost every country's had a civil war, many have had several. So like the Irish Civil War, and it's not only Irish people on both sides, is nationalists of different stripes on both sides. We tend to call them nationalists versus Republicans, or the Free State against the IRA, same thing. And they're almost all Catholics on both sides. So the book's about it entitled Brother Against Brother, and indeed Green Against Green. Green, of course, being the colour of Irish nationalism, because, of course, Thomas More wrote that poem about the Emerald Isle. And Thomas More, there he was writing in English, though he was Irish. But if we're really nationalistic, we'd only write in Irish. Thomas More, his son married an English woman, became accepted into English high society. Shows how we weren't rejected even in the early 19th century. Catholics as well, because the More family was a Catholic one. And he'd been to Trinity. We're often told, Trinity didn't allow Catholics in the 18th century. A lie, they did. Trinity College Dublin, I'm talking about, the most illustrious university in Ireland. And of course, the real colour of Ireland is St. Patrick's blue, sort of a midnight blue, and St. Patrick was not Irish. A lot of Irish Americans don't realise that one. So thinking back to when I was at UNIV, there was a Jewish chap and a German, and they shared a double set, as in a large drawing room with 2 bedrooms off it. I thought, that's fantastic, that's absolutely the way it should be. There should be no animus between them at all. It's not that the Jewish chap must forgive the German chap. He didn't personally do it. This is going on in his grandparents' generation. And so far as I know, they weren't at all involved either. So there should be no awkwardness. Sometimes I would bring my, at the time, German girlfriend to sit down and introduce her to people at the lunch table and hall, and there'd be Israelis, and that was that. There might be a moment of discomfort. But anyway, they got over it, and they got out like a house on fire, and that's the way it should be. You know, is when Jewish people were persecuted, of course, it was abominable, which is not to say that the Germans should be insulted or anything now. So nation, I suppose it's meant to be to do with birth. Like it's derived from natus, as in birth in Latin. That's why some people are rené, as in reborn. And some nations have had a renaissance, disappeared off the map for centuries, and then reappeared, like Poland, and so on. So some people say they're a patriot. Well, it's obviously related to patria, as in father, pater. So you see patria or la patrie in various languages, French, Italian, Romanian, Spanish. So although it's related to the word for father, it's feminine. So should we translate it motherland or fatherland? I'm not sure. Or there's rodina in Russia, as in motherland, was related to the word for birth. We talk about Mother Island, Mother India. So we see it's something to do with parentage, with birth. But you don't have to be born in that place to belong to that nation. Now, there's this apocryphal quotation attributed to the Duke of Wellington, the most famous doubler of all time. Duke of Wellington was a British Army general, the victor of Waterloo, and he was later Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But he's born in Ireland, and not just born there, his family had lived in Ireland for centuries. Really, their surname was Colley, not Wellesley. He was Arthur Wellesley. They changed it the generation before. And indeed, the Duke of Wellington, he was distantly related to George Colley, who was an Irish politician of the mid-20th century. But anyway, the Duke of Wellington, he supposedly said, if a horse is born in a donkey stable, it doesn't make it a donkey. As in, he was saying he was born in Ireland, but he was actually English. Just being born in Ireland doesn't make him Irish. But that he may well never have said that. It's not been convincingly attributed to him, and it only appeared after his death. The only hard evidence we have is one time when he entered a school in France as a child, he wrote about himself, "Je suis un gentilhomme d'Irlande." So he was saying he was from Ireland. Anyway, but you could be born outside of a place and still belong to a nationality. I had, say, school friends who were born in Germany, but they were British, not German. And Germany doesn't do dual nationality because their fathers were in the British Army of the Rhine and blah, blah, blah. So you can be born abroad and still not belong to that nationality. Fine. Belong to another one. John McCain, born in Panama, still an American. But born in a US Naval Hospital. Yeah, that's true, but it was still in Panama. But I'm still saying he was American. Okay, so even if Obama had been born in Kenya, his mother's American, he's American, that's that. So there can be an interaction, well, there is an interaction between ethnicity, that often leads to phenotype, as in observable heritable traits, hair color, skin color, shape of the nose, shape of the lips, whatever, to some extent height, hair texture, language, land, as in the actual area you're born, religion, culture. There's an interplay between all these things. But there can be some imposture here about where you were born, or is this town part of this country or that country. So what if your life were in jeopardy? Your life would be in jeopardy if you sometimes question these dearly held tenets. Like it was scintillating to meet a Pakistani almost 20 years ago who told me that he was against partition. Pakistan should not have left India, ought to have remained with India. Well, I had to applaud him for his immense moral courage and wisdom in doing that, in questioning the sort of the bedrock beliefs of his people, the actual foundation of his country. Which is not to say that you should just be contrarian and necessarily reject the intellectual framework in which your country is built. It's not always specious, but in his case, there was a reasonable case to say it. It's not that the Hindus were going to deny the Muslims' rights, it's that I'm afraid the Pakistani government denies non-Muslims' rights in their country, prohibiting them from being head of state and blah, 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 and prohibiting them from having more than a certain number of seats in the National Assembly and all the rest of it, not allowing people to convert, not allowing people to say what they want. So I know one Indian Muslim who told me how his parents moved east across the Punjab at partition, from what's now Pakistan to what's now India, because in the Congress Party, there's people to vouch for them, and so yeah, they would be happier and freer in India. So many things can go up to making a nationality, and no one factor is determinative. Nationality is a phenomenon which has always been around as long as history has been penned, something like 5,000 years. So it's notable that nationality can slumber for centuries and suddenly be reawakened. Well, Irish nationalism is perhaps not the best example of this, but anyway, 1916, okay, Home Rule was on the statute book, it'll be implemented as soon as the war is over. Republicanism was fairly weak, not that many people wanted a republic, certainly not many people thought it was practicable. But anyway, then there was the Easter Rising, the blood sacrifice of Patrick Pearse, and he said that will reawaken national spirit and lead to an insurgency and blah, 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 and there will be a republic. And obviously 5 years later, the major portion of Ireland left the United Kingdom, didn't have Home Rule, had Dominion status, as in on a par with Canada, Newfoundland, Australia, New Zealand, blah, blah, blah. And obviously 33 years later, became a republic. Easter Monday, 1949, as in to commemorate the Easter Rising, which began Easter Monday, 1916. But I just mentioned Newfoundland on the way. Newfoundland was a dominion, separate from Canada, and 1949 became part of Canada. Did that diminish the Newfie identity? I suppose it did. It's not as distinctive as it was, but there we are. So there's always this debate. Shall we have unity? Is that better? Unity between Canada and Newfoundland? Or shall we have independence? Independence for Newfoundland is somehow better. So these things, they go against each other. There's a trade-off, more unity or more independence. So in Ireland, we want unity, all right? But we had unity until 1921. We want independence, okay, but then you're not going to have unity. So which do you want? Okay, we could have both. Northern Ireland could leave the UK, join the Republic of Ireland, except we're in the EU, and so that we don't have independence either. But times change. Anyway, look at Yugoslavia. So for decades, Croat, Bosnian, Slovene, Montenegrin, and so forth, they'd all lived in peace and harmony, and people were scarcely aware of who was which ethnicity. And people who were only nominally religious would say, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Muslim, or I'm Orthodox. You ask a Croat, why do you say you're Catholic? You never go to church? Just to prove that I'm not a Serb. And a Serb, why do you say that you're Orthodox? Well, just to prove that I'm not a Croat. And a Bosniak, why do you call yourself a Muslim if you never go to the mosque? Well, just to prove I'm neither a Serb nor a Croat. But all of a sudden, in the early 90s, it mattered very much indeed. And often they were set at each other's throats. And there were massacres of people. So you see how the hideous side of nationalism can come out. I'm not saying that nationalism of the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosniaks, or anybody else is necessarily bad. I'm afraid the worst side of it came out. But they did that, but you did this first. It's difficult to get to the bottom of it. And yes, if the other group behave abominably, that's probably going to make your group behave abominably. I can't remember who wrote it. Those to whom evil are done do evil in return. They don't necessarily do it to those who did wrong to them. They sometimes do it to others. I remember going to a lecture in the National University of Singapore a long time ago, and the professor saying, well, a lot of our students are from abroad here, but they look like Singaporeans. But it's not obvious what a Singaporean is supposed to look like, because Singapore is about 80% ethnically Chinese, around 10% ethnically Indian, around 10% ethnically Malay, and the Chinese and Malay cannot always be distinguished at sight. So it really is a multiracial society, a bit like Malaysia. So they haven't emphasized Chinese background as being the core of their identity. Of course, the Malays were there first of all in Singapore. And even looking at Malaysia, the Malays were actually not there first of all either. There was the Orang Asli, the original people, a few of whom are still left. So attempts to counter nationality tend to fall flat. There was this Marxist notion of class solidarity, and it would turn out to be largely a damp squib. So nationality undergoes a subtle evolution, and it's an outstanding feature in human life. It's the central factor for some. Nationality matters very deeply. I knew a Welsh chap had a Welsh mug, a Welsh duvet, a Welsh towel, I can't think, Welsh shirt and whatever else, and always banging on about it. Is wonderful. You're so delighted to be Welsh. And honestly, we're not persecuting you because you're Welsh. He was a complete prick. We dislike you. We like all the other 3 million people in Wales. So he tried to put down any opposition to his detestable behaviour as being Cymrophobic. So there's a physiognomy of society. You know, nationalities are distinguished by particular features in terms of, well, cuisine or music or whatever, or codes of manners. And the national stereotypes, like about arm-waving Italians, or in that film Sliver, that British actress, I can't remember, says ass-pinching Italians, so saying something negative about them. Not that this bad behaviour doesn't exist there at all, nor is it unique to that nationality. But I wonder if this is labeling, if people sometimes play up to these negative stereotypes. Well, if you're going to be accused of it, you might as well be guilty of it. So Italians are said to be particularly emotional. I think there's some sort of truth in that, to value the visual over the verbal. I remember an Irish woman, she's saying to me, because in Ireland, of course, our culture is mainly verbal, not visual. Hit the nail on the head. So they try to make things be fashionable, look cool, whereas we try to make things be humorous to make them attractive in ads. So certain nationalities are said to be stolid, placid. Looking back to Charles Lindbergh saying he was whatever, the stalwart Nordic type, who's a notorious racist as well. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have achievements, so he wasn't gallant in flying across the Atlantic. Loathsome people can have their virtues as well. So these things are not straightforward. You talk about the stage Irish behaviour, not all of which is false. And sometimes we're sort of proud of alcoholism. Not everybody's an alcoholic, most people aren't. Almost everybody drinks, but As Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we have a considerable number of people who do not drink at all, perhaps thanks to the apostle of temperance, Father Matthew. Because he was from Tipperary, but he's got his big statue up in Cork. Father Matthew. The smell on Patrick's Bridge is wicked. How does Father Matthew stick it? So in my hometown, there's the big statue of this priest who tried to get people to give up alcohol, a 19th century priest, and it's right beside the River Lee, which doesn't smell bad at all, but it did a long time ago when there's some sort of folk song came out. So the stage Irish behaviour and the stage English behaviour. Notably, the stage Irishman is working class, the stage Englishman is upper class. It's not so much a Cockney or a Yorkshireman who's a miner, or a Cockney who's a Jarvey or something like that. And I know English people who play up to that stage English idea, but, you know, upper class, haughty, all the rest of it. Very well dressed, mannerly, but perhaps an ignoramus. So I noticed that the British, and particularly the English, Eastern Europe, have a very good reputation, much better than they deserve, actually. It's quite outdated and quite exaggerated, people's notion of what the United Kingdom is like, particularly England. There's a particular focus on London. Some people in Eastern Europe think that London is the whole of the UK. Some Londoners think so too. So there's often a certain arrogance which goes with being from a capital. I think the rest of the country is your garden, hardly matters. The capital gets so much attention and money. Anyway, so the capital-owning class build up their identity, and it's not a very localised one, whereas, because their locale is the world at the top end, the billionaires, whereas the lower someone's socioeconomic status, the more localised identity is. The people at the very lowest stratum of society don't travel much, don't know that much about the world, less likely to be polyglot or to speak a major international language. So I remember Orwell writing that the British intellectual class is the only one in Europe which is actively anti-patriotic. He said, the intellectuals are very international. They take their menus from Paris and their politics from Moscow. He was writing it in the 1930s. They might still take their menus from Paris. I'd probably take my menu from Italy if I'd given the choice. I'm not sure where they take their politics from now. It's certainly not Moscow, and it's not Washington, D.C. either. But the intellectuals, I think he probably means as a social set, not really as a social class. They're not the upper class or the upper middle class or whatever. Okay, often someone would be upper middle class educationally, but their income might be below that. And Orwell said that the intellectuals consider it worse to stand to attention for God Save the King than to steal from the poor box, because they thought that British nationalism was detestable. Now, like any nationalism, at its extreme end, it can be detestable when it's about racism or whatever, or hyper-aggression or closed-mindedness. So one should be a little bit open-minded and willing to think that, yes, my nation isn't automatically the best at anything, and if you think your country's never been on the wrong side of a war, you ought to get out more. So there's a tendency by nationalists to oversimplify to a dangerous degree. It's difficult to summarise nationality, as I've said, and some people think, oh, it's where you're born. Oh, it's your ethnicity. There ain't no black in the Union Jack. So say the white supremacists who won't accept that non-white people can't be British. Or a passport is just a piece of paper, things like that. So it requires some intellectual resources to question one's nationality. Does it really exist? When did it come into existence? Are there hard and fast rules about who belongs and who doesn't? And should this border really be here? Is it possible that we own some territory that we shouldn't, like the Falkland Islands? So people have often made a deep emotional investment in their national identity, and it could be a sunk cost. Well, we're wrong, but we just got to continue. I remember an in-law of mine, and it seems to me she's made the psychological shift to considering the European Union to be her nation. And that's why she went absolutely apoplectic when she found out I was a Brexiteer. Livid. I've never seen her so furious in all my life. So it'd be like being brought up by parents and having a very close, loving relationship with these parents, and at the age of 18 suddenly discovering that you've been adopted. If you suddenly find that your nationality is not as clear-cut as you thought, that you have ancestors who are of a different nationality, or your nationality might be somewhat invented, or whatever. So it would create an identity crisis. So nefarious demagogues can exploit nationality in a most nefarious manner because, as I say, it has such an emotional hold on people, and people find it very difficult to accept that then nationality might not be morally upstanding in its dealings with all the others. It makes me call to mind Stephen Decatur's toast. That US naval officer around about 1800 proposed a toast. Our country, in her intercourse with other nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong. So he was saying our country, as she interacts with other countries, we hope that our country is morally right. But even if our country is morally wrong, we will still take the side of our country. They would even fight in an unrighteous war. I realise if you're a soldier, a sailor and so on, you can't say, I'm out of this one. It's not a personal choice. You've got to obey orders. Armies, navies, air forces simply can't function on that basis. But I would hope other people would be decent enough, would be broad-minded enough to say, no, we shouldn't be fighting. It's very seldom clear-cut. There probably never was a conflict in which one side was 100% righteous and the other one was 100% wicked. So there are vices and virtues on both sides. So internationalists have proved incapable of providing an emotionally satisfying alternative, and sometimes they've been overly prejudiced against their own country, too damning of it, even when there are things which are to be valued in it. Like, who was it, George Canning, he lampooned these sort of globalists in his poem The Universal Man. A citizen of the world alone, a friend of every country except his own. He actually said but his own, but I think it works better if I say except his own, be more widely comprehended. So there is so much bombast around nationality. We're the best at everything. I saw this Americans saying this sort of stuff about the family separation policy of Trump, that we're the most compassionate country in the world, but we should separate parents from children because we're tough. Well, you know, you can't have it both ways. You're the toughest, you're the most compassionate. They militate against each other. So many countries have had colonies, but some say when they've done this, they've planted the seeds of their own destruction. Especially if, like the United Kingdom, say in the 18th century, say, we believe in parliamentary government. Well, for whites anyway. Because then there are these colonial legislatures, well, houses of burgesses, and they demanded a greater degree of self-governance, and that eventually led to wanting independence and revolution. So is it inescapable that this will happen? I mean, you look at Latin America, and now Spain didn't encourage parliamentary government, not at that time, but the colonies all broke away. And then you're forced into wars of repression if you're not willing to agree to it. And these are very seldom won. You know, you could look at Spain fighting to keep her colonies in 1800, then again in 1898. The Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, all failing to do so. So we're coming out of a period where there's been a very uneven distribution of power, where there's been Western hegemony, but the US is going to be somewhat a hegemon even now. So there'll be a transfer of power from the Western world to the non-Western world, particularly towards China. Now, China does have some storm clouds on the horizon, as in this greying population. There will be so many pensions to support, and there may be chickens coming home to roost in the case of, like, having poisoned their environment so much. But it seems that the West is incapable of providing for its own needs in terms of manufactured goods and obviously hydrocarbons, and is not switching to green energy quickly enough. So we may be moving to a bipolar world where China is at parity with the United States in terms of military might and economic clout and all the rest of it. But the reaction is surprising. Economic nationalism in the United States, now autarky, is really not going to work. And even Trump seems about to jettison this policy of sanctions against China, the trade war against China, before it's really started. So clearly he doesn't think it's going to bear fruit. If he really thought it would come to fruition, you'd continue it. Trade wars are good and easy to win. You don't hear him saying that anymore. So I think that his trade war had more to do with a closed-minded hyper-nationalism than economic policy. I don't know of any economic experts who thought that it was a wise idea. So there's an inflexible law that economic power leads to political power, and you're seeing that with China, obviously owning so much in Africa and having cordial relations with so many African countries, having these annual conferences for African presidents and dispersing their largesse there. So it follows from this that China will become mightier as American power in real and absolute terms declines. But this shouldn't be exaggerated. I don't think America is going to be weaker than China, but probably a peer of China. And there are these unwise American presuppositions about the universal applicability of their values and institutions. And these will be questioned more and more. There was this idea that they could simply transplant their institutions to other countries and they would grow well there, that they could turn Iraq into America. which is as daft as thinking you could turn America into Iraq. Well, Trump's trying. So it's taken on the character of a dogma, the belief that democracy is best at all times and in all places. Now, there's certain aspects of democracy I particularly value, such as freedom of expression. I realise that most people are too dim to be allowed a choice. As they say in that legal dictum, an uninformed choice is no choice at all. And as most people are incapable of informing themselves, they lack the lexis, they lack the ratiocination to understand these things, they lack the curiosity to seek out the information they need. In effect, that they are not informed. They are not making a proper choice. They are children in political terms. So it's unwise to go from the particular to general, to say that democracy works very well in this time and this place, therefore it is generally applicable, and we ought to introduce it everywhere, immediately, at gunpoint. So the West is no longer so triumphalist, and the neocons, well, in the United States, their stock is very low now. They thought they would spread democracy all across the Middle East. And where has it happened, really? Where has democratized? Egypt, not really. Maybe Tunisia a bit. Libya still mired in civil war. And, well, as for Syria, you tell me how that's worked out. So there have been hardly victories for the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan. Iraq, not exactly defeat either. Saddam Hussein is gone, and ISIS is now being defeated. But there's an Iraqi government which is closer to Iran than ever before. So in a sense, Iran was the real victor there. And things have not gone swimmingly in Afghanistan, to say the least. So Uncle Sam has not exactly covered himself in glory. And the same goes for the other NATO countries, such as the United Kingdom, which have participated in this. So I suspect that America shall not allow herself to be drawn into more conflicts that are discretionary. These were scarcely wars of national survival. The Bush doctrine has been jettisoned. Remember, that was that preemptive strikes. If we think there's a danger to us, we can attack them. Trouble about that one is it bites back. The Iranians could say, well, we think the United States is going to attack us. They've said it. They're massing on our border. So they've got the motive, the means, of the opportunity. Well, we're going to have to hit them before they hit us. It's mere self-defense, justified by military necessity. So two can play at that game, and it must be applicable to the Iranians as well. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So Bush saying we're going to liberate the oppressed, well, there was a big lacuna in that one, in that he obviously had to cooperate with some very repressive regimes for strategic reasons. He needed his air bridge into Afghanistan, so he had to look the other way when certain Central Asian dictators were applying electrodes to pudenda. Look at the Truman Doctrine, and that was that no European power should have any I'm thinking of the Monroe Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine, that they would help that armed minorities or whatever, or forged rigged elections in communist dictatorships to prevent the advance of communism, to roll it back where possible, which was more or less the inversion of the Monroe Doctrine. No European power should have any base in the American continent. And Truman was arrogating to America the right to militarily intervene everywhere. Now, many NATO countries helped him in that and thanked him for that. But what if another country say, well, the Chinese say, well, we have the right to overthrow whatever governments we want and militarily intervene anywhere to make sure that there's a government we find to our liking. So, what is the Trump doctrine? Deals? Well, he's not very good at making deals. He's good at withdrawing them, withdrawing from the Paris deal, withdrawing from the Iran deal, failing to make a deal with North Korea. Perhaps he wants to fight Iran, and Iran is no tottering structure. This would not be a cakewalk, all right? And Iraq seemed to be a walk in the park for the first month. Getting to Baghdad was the easy part. What does America do when she gets there? So I'm not overstating it. The United States is not about to perish. So the United States, well, I shan't go into its background too much, but to some extent it's founded on an ideology, that laid out in the Constitution. Constitutionalism. What else would I say? Certain rights. But these aren't completely new. Obviously, they're heavily borrowed from England and from ancient Rome. And the USSR was also a nation based around an ideology, but then they talked about nationalities within the USSR, including Russians. So people often wish to defend the reputation of their country. They won't allow outside criticism, although they might lacerate it themselves. But that's like criticizing a member of your own family. Might not appreciate it if an outsider did so. So there are confining limits of thought about nationality. There's certain things cannot be questioned. There's certain totems. You can't criticize our national hero. or you can't say that we're an invented people. You can't point out that we didn't originally live here, or that we're all descended from immigrants. I mean, particularly closed-minded nationalists wouldn't tolerate such observations being made. So people usually wish to magnify the nation, to vilify their enemies. If you point out that your nation has not always been righteous, would that vitiate this claim to be such a good people, the most compassionate people, the bravest people, and all the rest of it? So, as Socrates said, a wise man can fool himself. Even intelligent people can fall for these things. And actually, studies have shown that the cleverer people, because they've got greater powers of suasion, are skilled in this art of tricking even themselves into believing something. Whereas people who are not quite so brainy, they find it difficult to negate evidence and have to say, well, yeah, I have to reluctantly accept that that's true. So the real casuist, he can lawyer his way out of something which is absolutely clear-cut. So good to prove you're broad-minded, but some people take this Corinthian spirit too far and slag off their country too much, indulge in excessive self-flagellation. There shouldn't be too much self-congratulation either. I know countries always pat themselves on the back for being moral. We were right in the Second World War, therefore we're always right. Well, that doesn't hold true. So there's this pattern of thought which is very widespread to exalt heroes, to damn foes, and saying, oh, we fought on even though the situation was hopeless. You see that in the United Kingdom in the Second World War. Obviously, there are many other conflicts where the UK has thrown in the towel. And obviously, the UK, they delude themselves as really the Soviets won the Second World War for them. So national superiority is a highly convenient rationalization, this desire to feel proud about things, even if one hasn't achieved something. You know, I didn't win those Olympic medals for Ireland or the United Kingdom, or I didn't write these works of literature, or I didn't build those fantastic buildings, but I like to take credit for it. At the same time, I don't want to take the rough with the smooth. I'd rather not carry the can for slavery. I'd rather not carry the can for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So do I have to accept both? Remember Bob Hawke, the Australian Prime Minister? He met me once, pinnacle of his career, and he said, we can't be proud of Gallipoli if we don't face up to the wickedness of the Sturgeon generation. Gallipoli, that battle in the First World War, 1915, the Australians lost, actually, along with the British and the other allies. And that's the thing, is you can be just as gallant when you lose as when you win. You could be just as cowardly when you win as when you lose. You might have just had better weapons and more numbers. Anyway, I digress. But the Sturgeon generation, that's Aboriginal children in Australia, were taken away by the government and given to white families and brought up in orphanages. But isn't that equality? The government has a duty to provide for the welfare of children, and if parents aren't, say, sending them to school, we're going to take you away. We don't care what your ethnicity is. This is equal rights. But anyway, these days it's viewed as abominable. Anyway, there's an instinctive desire to believe that one's own people are goodies and the others are baddies. It's not always wrong, and it's not always right either. So people might twist and stretch the truth to fit around this preconceived notion of moral rectitude of one's own side and the turpitude of the other side. Now, these ideas do not lack for popular support. Most people are not terribly good at objectivity. The UK has always beaten herself up over her wrongdoing, and indeed there was wrongdoing. The only other country which does this so much, well, so even more actually, is Germany. And the United Kingdom is surely unique in having her erstwhile enemies with statues there, Gandhi, Washington, and so on. Okay, Gandhi didn't actually fight against the British Empire. And so they wanted to be disconnected from the empire. Two very different men. Gandhi, who aimed at universal betterment and was mostly a pacifist. Washington was more impatient. He held people in slavery. He was a racist. This was typical for the time. He could have gone for a tax strike. That might have sufficed in achieving his goals. But no, he went for a bloody revolution, despite being a sort of very privileged person, much more so than Gandhi was under the system that prevailed in his country at the time. So, but neither went in for a categorical denial of all good in the UK, recognising there was some good, there were some virtuous institutions to be emulated in the country they were founding. All right, I'll leave it there for today and talk about denialism tomorrow.